They called him the Stallion Whisperer of Fallujah, the most decorated cavalry specialist in Iraq's deadliest regions. But to the people of Shadow Valley, Montana, Daniel Storm Blackwood was just the quiet veteran who'd returned to his father's legendary horse ranch after 2 decades of service. For months, the Serpiente Cartel had been terrorizing their peaceful ranching community, thinking they owned these mountain trails until they made the biggest mistake of their lives when Ramon Vargas and his thugs poisoned Thomas Blackwood's prized stallions, the same horses that had carried 3 generations of local riders. They thought they were just intimidating another stubborn old rancher. What the ruthless cartel leader didn't know was that this weathered 70-year-old was about to whistle a signal that would summon a force even the most hardened drug runners had learned to fear in the deserts of Iraq. The morning mist still clung to the valley as Thomas Blackwood moved through his daily routine with the same methodical precision he'd used for 50 years. His weathered hands, marked by decades of working with the West's most spirited horses, carefully checked each saddle strap in the family's historic stable. The smell of leather and hay filled the air, a scent that had defined his life since. He first started training horses alongside his own father in this very barn. Across the dirt road, Eleanor's country kitchen hummed with early morning activity. Mary, the owner's granddaughter who'd practically grown up watching Thomas work with troubled horses, couldn't help glancing worriedly at the stable every few minutes. "Your coffee's getting cold, Thomas," she called out, her voice carrying a warmth that barely masked her growing concern about recent changes in their valley. Thomas acknowledged her with a slight nod, his attention still focused on a young Mustang that had arrived yesterday, its wild spirit reminding him of horses he'd gentled decades ago. Some things couldn't be rushed, especially not in a world where the old ways of horsemanship were becoming increasingly rare. In the diner, Deputy Chief Rebecca Martinez nursed her cooling coffee, her eyes tracking 3 black SUVs as they rolled past Blackwood's stables for the 4th time that week. Their tinted windows concealed their occupants, but everyone knew who they were. The Serpiente Cartel had been making their presence known with increasing boldness. "They're getting bolder," Rebecca muttered as Thomas entered the diner, wiping his hands on a worn leather cloth. The creases around his eyes had deepened in recent months, but his movement still carried the precise efficiency of a master horseman. Mary placed a fresh cup of coffee before him, her hands trembling slightly. "They were in here yesterday afternoon. Thomas, 8 of them, scared my customers half to death." Her voice quivered with barely contained fear. "Trouble?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Mary hesitated, glancing toward the window. "Their leader, the one they call El Serpiente, he made it clear they'd be expecting special treatment from now on. Said it was for protection." The last word came out bitter and scared. The bell above the diner's door chimed as Sheriff Jack Morrison entered, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. He nodded to each person in turn before settling next to Thomas. "Morning, folks. Suppose you've heard about Richardson's ranch." Thomas wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "Billy mentioned something yesterday. Vandalism?" "That's putting it mildly," Rebecca sighed, accepting a coffee refill from Mary. "Shot 2 of his best quarter horses, left one of their marks, a coiled snake spray-painted on his barn door. 3rd ranch this month. First it was the Peterson place," Mary added quietly. "Then the Wilson spread, now this." Jack's jaw tightened. "They're smart. Never enough evidence to make charges stick, and folks are too scared to testify anyway." Thomas studied his reflection. In the coffee's dark surface, fear's a funny thing, Jack. Makes people forget who they are, what they're capable of. Speaking from experience, Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already knew part of the answer. Not many in town knew much about Thomas's son Storm or the man he'd become. Thomas had always been private about family matters, especially after losing his wife Sarah to cancer 5 years ago. Thomas's eyes took on a distant look, seeing something far beyond the diner's walls. Back in '04, got a call from Storm. He was deployed, couldn't say where, said he'd learned something important about fear, that it's not about being fearless. It's about what you do when you're afraid that defines you. What happened to him? Mary asked softly, drawn into the rare moment of Thomas sharing something personal. A slight smile crossed Thomas's face. Last I heard, he was training others, teaching them what he'd learned about standing up when everything in you wants to. Stand down. The rumble of engines grew louder outside. Through the window, they watched as 2 black SUVs parked directly in front of Blackwood's stables. Ramon El Serpiente Vargas stepped out, his expensive snakeskin boots at odds with the rural setting. He deliberately kicked over the vintage mounting block Thomas had restored, a piece of local history he'd saved from the old cavalry outpost. "Better clean that up, old man," he called out, his voice carrying through the diner windows. "Wouldn't want any of your precious horses to trip and break a leg." Thomas continued sipping his coffee, seemingly unperturbed by the display of intimidation. But Rebecca noticed how his knuckles had whitened around the cup. "They're pushing," Jack said quietly, "testing boundaries, seeing who'll break first. That how you see it, Chief?" Thomas's voice remained steady. Rebecca met his gaze. "How do you see it, Thomas?" "I see men who mistake cruelty for strength, who think fear equals respect." Thomas stood slowly, leaving money for his coffee. "Learned a long time ago that men like that don't stop pushing until they hit something solid." As Thomas walked toward the door, Mary called after him, "Thomas, what are you going to do?" He paused, his hand on the door handle. "Same thing I do every morning, Mary. Train horses, serve this community, remember who I am." He looked back at them, and for just a moment they saw something in his eyes that reminded them of the quiet strength he'd passed on to his son. Question is, when the time comes, will this valley remember who it is? The door closed behind him with a gentle chime. They watched through the window as Thomas crossed the dirt road, walking past the sneering cartel members without acknowledgement. He began righting the fallen mounting block, his movements unhurried but purposeful. "Sometimes I forget," Mary said softly, "that he raised someone like Storm before Storm was what he became." Rebecca's face was grim. "Way things are going, we might all be reminded soon enough." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over Shadow Valley, its light catching the vintage Blackwood Stables sign that had guided riders for 3 generations. The shadow of the sign fell across the dirt road like a line drawn in the sand, a boundary that once crossed would change everything. Ramon Vargas sat astride his custom Range Rover, watching the stable through designer sunglasses. The morning sun glinted off his gold watch and the serpent ring on his finger. Behind him, 6 cartel members waited in their vehicles, engines idling with predatory patience. The old rancher was still inside, visible through the stable windows. As he worked with a spirited young horse, his movements precise, methodical, showing the kind of patience that had begun to grate on Ramon's nerves. "He's either stupid or brave," Miguel Rodriguez muttered from the passenger seat, flicking his butterfly knife open and closed. Everyone else in the valley's falling in line, but he acts like we don't even exist. Ramon's snakeskin jacket creaked as he shifted. Don't much care which. Time we had a chat with our friendly neighborhood horse whisperer. Inside Eleanor's country kitchen, Mary's hand trembled as she reached for the phone. Rebecca stopped her with a gentle touch. Don't, the deputy chief whispered. Thomas knows what he's doing. The cartel members spread out as Ramon approached the stable's open door, their movements carrying the casual menace of circling wolves. Through the windows, they could see Thomas calmly working with the young Mustang, seemingly oblivious to their presence. Nice morning for breaking horses, old man, Ramon called out, his voice carrying mock politeness. Thomas emerged from the round pen, wiping his hands on a leather cloth, his movements remaining unhurried, his attention still focused on the horse that watched him with newfound trust. Every morning's nice when you're helping wild spirits find their way, he replied, his eyes focused on the Mustang rather than on the men surrounding him. Ramon stepped closer, using his height to loom over the older man. And that's actually what I wanted to discuss. See, some folks in the valley, they've learned their lesson. They understand how things work now. But you, he reached out, tapping the Blackwood Stables logo on Thomas's work shirt, you seem confused about the natural order of things. Thomas's eyes moved from the Mustang to Ramon's face, and something in his gaze made the cartel leader take an unconscious step backward. Natural order's a funny thing, son. Nature's got a way of surprising folks who think they understand it. Miguel moved forward, his knife catching the morning light, but Ramon held up a staying hand, his smile cold as a mountain stream. Strong. Words for someone your age, living on borrowed time. Time's a gift, Thomas replied, turning toward his tack room. What matters is how you use it. Ramon's hand shot out, gripping Thomas's arm. Nobody walks away from me, old man. What happened next occurred so quickly that Miguel would later have trouble describing it. One moment Ramon held Thomas's arm, the next he was stumbling backward, his wrist twisted at an awkward angle. Thomas stood exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Son, he said quietly, there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who know when they're outmatched, and those who have to learn the hard way. Question is, which kind are you? Miguel watched in stunned silence as Thomas returned to his work, his movements as precise as ever. Ramon rubbed his wrist, rage building in his eyes. Boss, Miguel started. Shut up. Ramon's voice cracked like a whip. Tonight, we show this valley what happens to people who don't show proper respect, starting with those precious horses he loves so much. Inside the stable, Thomas continued working with the young Mustang, his movements as precise as ever, but those who knew him well might have noticed how he positioned himself to keep the entrance in view, how he chose his movements to maintain clear sightlines to all approaches. Rebecca Martinez entered, concern evident on her face. Word spreading about what happened. Ramon's not the type to let this go. No, Thomas agreed, studying the Mustang's body language before him. Men like that never are. Pride won't let them. I could post deputies. No, Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. Sometimes the best defense isn't the most obvious one. Rebecca studied the older man, seeing something shift beneath his calm exterior. You're planning something. Planning? Thomas's smile carried decades of secrets. Just remembering something Storm told me once about his time overseas. Said sometimes victory isn't about who has the most guns. It's about who has the strongest spirit. As afternoon faded into evening, Miguel Rodriguez sat in his vehicle across from Blackwood Stables, watching Thomas secure the barn for the day. His hand kept returning to the silver crucifix his grandmother had given him, fingers worrying the metal as he remembered her words about choosing the right path. Through his earpiece, he could hear Ramon coordinating tonight's action. They would send a message, make an example, but as Miguel watched Thomas walk home, straight-backed and dignified despite the weight of threats around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The sun began to set over Shadow Valley, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The vintage sign of Blackwood Stables cast long shadows across the dirt road, still, standing proudly despite the shadow of violence gathering around it. In Eleanor's country kitchen, Mary watched the stable through worried eyes, her hands clutching a phone she knew she wouldn't use. "Lord," she whispered, "what are you planning?" "Thomas!" Across town, in a secluded barn behind his house, Thomas opened an old cavalry trunk he hadn't touched in years. Inside, beneath carefully preserved photographs of Storm in various remote locations, lay a satellite phone and a worn notebook. His fingers traced a familiar number, one he'd memorized years ago, but never thought he'd need to use. "Some bonds," he murmured to the empty room, "never break." The night deepened over Shadow Valley as Cartel vehicles began moving into position, their headlights off, their movements carrying deadly purpose. But in his quiet house, Thomas Blackwood sat calmly at his desk, the satellite phone before him, waiting for the moment when past and present would collide, when those who dealt in fear would learn about a different kind of strength, one forged in the crucible of modern warfare and tempered by years of quiet service. Through his window, he could see 3 black SUVs gathering at the far end of the valley road. Ramon Vargas stood beneath a streetlight, smoke from his cigarette curling around him like a serpent's breath. More vehicles were arriving, their headlights off, engines nearly silent. Inside Eleanor's kitchen, Mary turned the sign to closed, her hands shaking slightly. Rebecca Martinez stood beside her, watching the gathering Cartel members through the blinds. "Shouldn't we do something?" Mary whispered. Rebecca's hand rested on her service weapon. Thomas said to wait, said timing was everything. The night air carried the sound of boots on gravel as Ramon's men moved into position. Miguel Rodriguez hung back, his grandmother's cross clicking softly against his chest. Something about the old rancher's calm throughout the day had set him on edge. "Remember," Ramon addressed his men, his voice carrying in the still night air, "we're teaching a lesson about respect, about consequences." He held up a syringe filled with dark liquid, moonlight glinting off his serpent ring. "When a horse goes bad, you put it down." Thomas watched them approach his stable, his expression unchanged. He opened his desk drawer, removing the satellite phone and the worn notebook. A familiar number was written on the first page, the ink faded, but still legible. The memory hit him with sudden clarity. Iraq, 2004, when Storm had called him from. Some classified location, explaining why he'd chosen his path, why some fights were worth more than others. Ramon's voice cut through his memories. "Bring him out! Let him watch this!" Thomas rose slowly, moving to his front door with measured steps. Outside, Cartel members had formed a loose semicircle around his stable. Ramon stood at its center, syringe in hand. "Last chance, old man," he called out. "Kneel and apologize for disrespecting me this morning, and maybe we just cripple one horse instead of poisoning them all." Thomas emerged onto his porch, his posture straight, hands clasped calmly before him. The sight of his composure, in the face of such threat, made several cartel members shift uneasily. "Son," his voice carried clearly despite its softness, "you're about to make the kind of mistake that changes lives." Ramon laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Look around, old man, you're alone. No one's coming to help you." "That's where you're wrong, boy." Something shifted in Thomas's stance, a subtle transformation that Miguel noticed even if he couldn't name it. The quiet rancher seemed to fade, replaced by something harder, something forged in the understanding of real conflict. "See, there's something you need to understand about old soldiers and their war horses." As if on cue, a distant thunder began to build, not the growl of cartel vehicles, but something deeper, more primal. Ramon's head snapped toward the sound, the syringe freezing halfway to the nearest horse's neck. "We never fight alone," Thomas continued, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "And we never forget our bonds." The thunder grew louder, and now hoofbeats began echoing from both ends of the valley road. But they weren't just any horses. These moved with military precision, their riders carrying themselves with unmistakable combat discipline. "What the hell is this?" one of Ramon's men demanded, backing toward his SUV. "This," Thomas's smile hadn't wavered, "is just the advance guard. The real cavalry's still 10 minutes out." More riders were arriving by the minute, their movements speaking of years of specialized training. These weren't weekend trail riders or local ranch hands. These were combat veterans who moved like they'd never left the service. Miguel watched in growing awe as the cartel's advantage evaporated. Where moments ago they had surrounded one old rancher, now they found themselves facing an organized force that moved with practiced coordination. Ramon's facade of control cracked slightly. "You're bluffing. No way you could—" One whistle, Thomas. Cut him off. That's all it took. One signal to remind my son's brothers that the stable you're about to poison doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to everyone who's ever found healing here. The syringe slipped from Ramon's fingers as more riders emerged from the darkness, their movements speaking of years of cavalry training. "You've got 10 minutes, Thomas said quietly. 10 minutes to decide what kind of men you really want to. Because when Captain Daniel Storm Blackwood arrives with the main force, there won't be any more decisions to make." Ramon backed away, his previous bravado evaporating in the face of something he didn't understand, the unshakable calm of a man who had raised a warrior and learned from his son's example. "Mount up!" he barked to his men, trying to maintain control. "This isn't over, old man." "No," Thomas agreed, watching them scramble to their vehicles. "It's just beginning." As the cartel members fled into the night, Rebecca approached Thomas, taking in the scene, the gathering veterans, the untouched stable, and the man who stood between them, transformed from rancher to something else entirely before their eyes. "These riders," Rebecca nodded toward the veterans, now securing the area with military precision. "They came awful fast." "Been waiting a long time for my signal, Rebecca. Some bonds can never be broken, some debts never expire." In the distance, more hoofbeats could be heard. More veterans arriving, drawn by a network of brotherhood that had laid dormant but never died. Above them, the vintage sign of Blackwood Stables caught the moonlight, its letters standing proud. Against the darkness, the stable that had healed 3 generations of troubled horses stood untouched by the poison that had threatened to claim it. Miguel Rodriguez sat in his SUV, watching Thomas through the windshield as he coordinated with the arriving veterans. For the first time, he saw what they'd all missed. Beneath the quiet exterior of a small-town horse trainer was a man who commanded respect, not through fear, but through a lifetime of earned loyalty. The night was far from over, and Shadow Valley was about to learn what real strength looked like. Not the false power of intimidation, but the unshakable force of men united by honor, duty, and bonds that transcended time itself. The Serpient compound pulsed with nervous energy as Ramon Vargas paced the worn floorboards of his office. Through tinted windows, he watched his men fortifying the perimeter, their movements lacking their usual confidence. 40 riders just entered the valley, Carlos, his security chief, reported, bursting through the door. All veterans, moving in formation like some kind of cavalry unit. Ramon held his crystal tequila glass against the wall. How did one whistle bring this many this fast? In the corner, Miguel worked on his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. Boss, you don't understand what we're dealing with. Daniel Blackwood isn't just some soldier. He turned the screen toward Ramon. 3 bronze stars, 1 silver star, led one of the most successful mounted units in Iraq. They called him the Stallion Whisperer of Fallujah. Why? Ramon demanded, his composure cracking. He specialized in impossible missions, places no one else would go. There's a mission report here. Miguel scrolled through classified documents. He led his mounted unit through the heaviest insurgent resistance ever recorded in the region to evacuate a surrounded village. Everyone said it was suicide. They saved 50 civilians that day. Carlos, who'd been quiet until now, cleared his throat. My cousin was in Iraq. Used to talk about a cavalry captain who could communicate with horses in the middle of combat. Said the animals moved like they were one with their riders. They never even saw them coming. That's not the worst part, Miguel continued. The men he's calling, they're not just veterans. They're his old unit, his training corps, everyone who ever served with him. These aren't just riders, boss. They're organized, connected, and they've got chapters everywhere. Marco's face darkened as the implications sank in. They'd built their reputation on fear, on the assumption that their targets would always be weaker, more afraid. But now, across town, Thomas stood in front of his stable, directing arriving veterans with the same quiet authority he'd used in training horses. His training ring had become an impromptu command center, with military precision replacing traditional horsemanship. Mary approached carrying coffee and sandwiches. Thomas, you need to eat something. Been standing there for hours. Thanks, Mary. He took the coffee, but waved off the food. Saw too many men miss important signs because they were focused on their stomachs. A group of 4 riders approached at a canter, their horses moving with combat-trained discipline. The lead rider, a weathered man in his 50s, dismounted and approached Thomas with military bearing. Master Sergeant James Cooper reporting, sir. Captain Blackwood sent us ahead. We're your advance reconnaissance. Thomas nodded, recognizing the tactical move. Glad to have you, Sergeant. Valley's about 5 square miles. Serpiente holds the north end, compound behind the old silver mine. Cooper pulled out a topographical map, and other veterans gathered around as Thomas detailed the situation. Their formations and responses were automatic, decades of training kicking in like they'd never left the service. Rebecca Martinez watched from her patrol vehicle, amazement crossing her face as Shadow, Valley transformed into something resembling a military operation. More veterans arrived every hour, each group integrating seamlessly into the growing force. Inside Eleanor's kitchen, now serving as an unofficial briefing area, Mary served coffee to a mix of townspeople and newly arrived veterans. The atmosphere had shifted from fear to cautious hope as stories were shared. A young veteran rushed into the diner, face flushed with excitement. "You've got to see this. The mountain passes are full. Must be 70 more riders heading this way." Outside, Thomas stood with Cooper studying the valley map. "They'll try something before the main force arrives," he said quietly. "Ramon's pride won't let him wait. Let them try," Cooper replied grimly. "We've got 40 years of combat experience surrounding that compound. These cartel boys want to play soldier. Let's show them what real cavalry looks like." A veteran approached at a gallop. "Sir, movement at the compound. Looks like they're splitting up. Small groups heading out different directions." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "They're probing our defenses, testing our response time." He turned to Cooper. "Remember Fallujah? The insurgents tried the same thing against Storm's unit." Cooper grinned. "Like riding a bike, sir. Never forget." He began issuing orders, veterans moving with practiced efficiency to counter the cartel's movements. At the compound, Ramon watched his scouts depart, trying to regain control of a situation spiraling beyond his understanding. "Find their weak points," he ordered. "These old-timers can't cover everything." Miguel shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, maybe we should consider pulling back, calling help from other territories." "We are the help," Ramon exploded. "We're the ones people fear. I won't let some geriatric war relics take that away." But his words lacked their usual conviction. Through the window, he could see more veteran riders arriving, their formation perfect, their purpose clear. These weren't weekend warriors playing at being tough. These were men and women who'd faced real combat, real death, and had emerged stronger. In his stable office, Thomas looked at an old photograph again. Storm stood with his cavalry unit, their faces showing the kind of brotherhood that only comes from facing death together. The satellite phone rang. "Storm checking in? How's it looking, Dad?" "Like old times, son. They're testing us, looking for weakness, just like Fallujah. Remember what I told you about the difference between thugs and warriors?" Thomas smiled slightly. "Thugs fight because they can. Warriors fight because they have to. We're 15 minutes out, 3 squadrons. Strong. Can you hold?" Thomas watched through his window as veterans moved with practiced precision, securing positions, establishing communications, transforming Shadow Valley into a fortress. "Oh, we'll hold. These boys are about to learn the difference between intimidation and real strength." The cartel's first probe came from the east. 6 black SUVs running dark, trying to slip through the veterans' perimeter. They made it 3 ridges before finding their path blocked by mounted riders arranged with military precision. As they turned to find another route, more riders moved silently into position behind them. "Like fish in a barrel," Cooper muttered into his radio, watching from his elevated position. "Just like you said, Thomas, they're thinking like thugs, not soldiers." The trapped cartel members gathered in a tight circle, their hushed arguments carrying clearly in the night air. "Hey, this was a mistake," one hissed to their leader. "These aren't normal folk we're dealing with. They're playing chess while we're playing checkers." Before his companion could respond, bright spotlights suddenly flooded the valley from all directions. The cartel members found themselves illuminated from every angle. while their observers remained hidden in darkness. "Gentlemen," Cooper's voice cut through the night, carrying the unmistakable tone of military command, "I suggest you consider your next move very carefully." At the Serpient compound, Ramon paced nervously as he waited for reports. The radio crackled with his trapped men's voices, the fear evident even through the static. "They've got us surrounded, boss. These veterans, they're moving like a real cavalry unit." "What do we do?" Another voice cut in. "Every escape route is blocked." Miguel watched Ramon's face darken. "We should pull everyone back," he suggested quietly. "Regroup while we can." "Shut up!" Ramon hurled a chair across the room. "I won't let some old-timers make us look weak." "Too late for that," Carlos muttered, earning a murderous glare from Ramon. Across the valley at Blackwood Stables, now serving as the command center, Thomas coordinated the veteran movements with the same quiet efficiency he'd used in training horses. The training ring had transformed into a tactical operations center with maps and communication equipment covering every surface. "Echo team reports movement from the north," a veteran radio operator announced. "Larger group this time, maybe. 20 vehicles." Thomas studied the map, his mind calculating angles and options. "They're getting desperate, trying to overwhelm one section of our perimeter." He keyed his radio. "All units be advised. Main thrust coming from the north, but watch your flanks. This is probably a diversion." Mary entered with fresh coffee, her eyes widening at the sophistication of the operation. "Thomas, half the town's gathered at the diner. They want to know what's happening." "Tell them to stay inside," Thomas replied without looking up from his map. "This is about to get complicated." As if confirming his words, the sound of engines roared from the north, but these weren't the stealthy approaches of before. This was a full-on charge, the cartel apparently abandoning subtlety for brute force. "Here they come," Cooper's voice crackled over the radio. 20 vehicles moving fast, no tactical formation, just raw speed. "Just like we planned." Thomas's voice remained steady. "Let them through the first line." The charging cartel vehicles roared past the first veteran positions, their whoops of triumph dying in their throats as they realized they were being channeled, not evading. Steel cables suddenly pulled taut across side trails, forcing them down. "A predetermined path. Now," Thomas commanded. Veterans emerged from the tree lines and ridges, moving with coordinated precision. Police vehicles appeared at strategic points, lights flashing. Within moments, the cartel's charge had been contained in a narrow valley, completely surrounded. "What the hell is this?" one of the trapped cartel members demanded. "This," Thomas's voice carried clearly as he rode forward on his own horse, "is what real tactical planning looks like." The old rancher sat calmly in his saddle, surrounded by men and women who moved with the deadly grace of trained cavalry. The contrast between their disciplined presence and the cartel's chaotic charge couldn't have been clearer. "Last chance," Thomas announced. "Surrender your vehicles, walk away. No charges filed, no consequences. Continue this fight, and you'll learn why they called my son's unit the Ghosts of Fallujah." One of the younger cartel members suddenly gunned his engine and charged directly at Thomas. Before anyone could react, 3 mounted veterans moved in perfect coordination. The vehicle's front wheels were swept out, its driver expertly detained, the entire incident over in seconds. "That's one choice," Thomas commented mildly. "Anyone else want to try their luck against men and women who've spent decades perfecting the art of mounted combat?" Back at the compound, Ramon listened to his men's radio calls with growing desperation. "Fall back!" He screamed into the radio, "Everyone fall back!" But it was too late. The veterans had predicted this too, cutting off escape routes with the same military precision that had trapped them. One by one, cartel members found themselves facing a choice: surrender or escalate against opponents who clearly outmatched them. "Boss," Carlos's voice shook slightly, "we've lost contact with the North team. Echo team's surrounded. This isn't working." Miguel watched Ramon's world crumbling. He'd built his power on fear and intimidation, but these veterans seemed immune to both as they systematically dismantled the cartel's reputation with each perfectly executed maneuver. In Elena's country, kitchen townspeople watched through windows as the veterans efficiently contained the cartel's attempted show of force. Rebecca Martinez stood with Mary and others, amazement on their faces, as Shadow Valley transformed into something resembling a military operation. "My God," Mary whispered, "look at them. They moved like they'd been riding together for years." Rebecca replied, watching with professional appreciation. "Just not here, not recently, but some skills you never forget." Thomas's voice came over the radio again, addressing the surrounded cartel members. "Captain Blackwood's main force is 10 minutes out. When they arrive, this ends one way or another. Choice is yours how it ends." The trapped cartel members looked at each other, their usual bravado replaced by uncertainty. They were used to being the predators, not the prey. Now they found themselves caught in a trap laid by men and women who'd learned their trade in the harshest school imaginable. Miguel watched from his hidden position as more cartel members surrendered, weapons clattering to the ground like falling dominoes. As he observed Thomas directing the operation, he finally understood what they'd missed about him. This wasn't just an old rancher who'd raised a soldier. This was a man who'd learned from his warrior son, who understood that real strength came from discipline, not fear. The night's first engagement was ending, but Miguel knew it was just the beginning. Ramon's pride would demand retaliation, but for the first time, Miguel wondered if he was on the wrong side of history. The quiet rancher had just shown them what real power looked like. Not the power of fear, but the power of disciplined strength and unbreakable bonds. Dawn's first light crept over Shadow Valley as veterans processed the captured cartel members. Cooper supervised the operation with military efficiency, cataloging seized weapons and vehicles while Rebecca handled the legal documentation. The night's engagement had yielded more than just prisoners. It had shattered the cartel's aura of invincibility. 32 captured, 8 vehicles impounded, Cooper reported to Thomas at the command center. Most of them are young, scared, never faced real opposition before. Thomas stood at the operations map, marking updated positions with the same precision he'd used, gentling wild horses. And the others? 6 escaped back to the compound, including Ramon's Lieutenant Carlos. Your boy storms about 3 minutes, out with the main force. In Elena's kitchen, now serving as a support hub, Mary and other townspeople provided coffee and food to the veterans while sharing information about cartel movements. The fear that had paralyzed the valley for months was being replaced by something else: hope. "Never seen anything like it," an elderly resident told the gathered crowd. Way they moved, way they worked together, like watching a dance they'd practiced their whole lives. A veteran at the counter smiled. "That's because some things you never forget. And Captain Blackwood, he taught us more than just tactics. He taught us what real strength looks like." Thomas's satellite phone rang. "Dad," Storm's voice came through clear and strong. We're seeing the aftermath of your handiwork. You remembered everything I taught you. Had a good teacher, Thomas replied, watching the sunrise paint his stable in shades of gold. Your men performed perfectly. They're not just my men anymore, Dad. They're yours too now. You showed them something important tonight, that the principles we learned in combat work anywhere tyranny tries to take root. Thomas watched as more veterans secured the area, their movements precise, their purpose clear. How far out are you? 1 minute. Ramon's about to learn why they called us ghosts, not because we couldn't be seen, but because by the time you saw us, it was already too late. The ground seemed to vibrate as Captain Daniel Storm Blackwood's mounted force entered Shadow Valley. 3 squadrons of riders moving in perfect formation. Leading them was Storm's Black Stallion, flanked by riders who moved like shadows. Through the dawn light, the morning sun glinted off polished tack, creating an image of unstoppable force. Thomas stood outside his stable, watching the arrival with the same calm he'd shown throughout the crisis. Cooper stood beside him, coordinating the integration of new forces into their defensive positions. Just like old times, Cooper remarked. Better odds than Fallujah, Thomas replied with a slight smile. Ramon and his remaining men watched in professional dread as the mounted force rolled past their observation points. Mother of God, Carlos murmured. Look at that precision, like watching the cavalry roll into a war zone. Because that's exactly what it is, Miguel explained, now serving as an impromptu analyst. These aren't just veterans answering a call. These are men and women who never stopped being soldiers. They just needed the right cause to remind them. The mounted forces' lead riders reached Thomas's position and halted with military precision. Storm dismounted from his stallion, his bearing still razor-sharp, despite years in civilian life. For a moment, father and son just looked at each other, decades of shared understanding passing between their gazes. Couldn't just have a quiet retirement, could you, Dad? Storm asked, a slight smile breaking his official demeanor. Shouldn't have touched my horses, son. They embraced briefly, then immediately turned to business. Thomas led Storm into the command center where updated tactical displays showed the current situation. Ramon's forces are contained, Thomas reported. His probing attacks failed. His men are starting to understand what real opposition looks like. And Ramon himself? Cornered in the compound, increasingly unstable, making calls trying to get reinforcements from other territories. Storm studied the tactical display, his mind working through scenarios with practiced ease. He won't get them, he said confidently. I've already contacted our networks. Once they learned who was involved, let's just say the other cartels have no interest in facing cavalry veterans. In Eleanor's kitchen, now serving as a secondary command post, Mary watched the constant flow of veterans through her doors with amazement. Each group moved with the same disciplined purpose, integrating seamlessly into the operation. Never seen anything like it, she told Rebecca Martinez. Way they work together like they can read each other's minds. That's what real training looks like, Carlos answered, having surrendered himself after seeing the arrival of the main force. He accepted a coffee with cuffed hands. What real brotherhood looks like. We thought we were professionals, but these people... He shook his head. They're in a different league entirely. At the Serpiente compound, Ramon's grip on reality seemed to be slipping by the minute. He paced frantically, ignoring Miguel's attempts to reason with him. You don't understand, Ramon shouted, his eyes wild. We can't let them win. We're Serpientes. We're feared. Boss, Miguel tried again. It's over. Captain Blackwood's force has arrived. We're facing 3 squadrons of combat veterans led by one of the most decorated cavalry officers in Iraq. We need to think about survival now. Survival? Ramon's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. I'll show them survival. I'll show them what happens when you corner a serpent. Back at the command center, Miguel's face went pale as he listened to radio transmissions from the compound. Captain Blackwood. Ramon's completely lost it. He's rigging explosives. Talking about taking half the valley with him. Storms. Expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Those who'd served with him in Iraq recognized it, the quiet focus that preceded his most daring operations. Dad, he turned to Thomas, remember that night outside Fallujah, the weapons cache? Thomas's eyes lit with understanding. Same approach, same principle, different stakes. Storm turned to Carlos. Want to earn some redemption? Carlos straightened. Tell me what you need, Captain. The next hour saw an operation that demonstrated why Storm had earned his reputation in Iraq. Veterans moved into position with practiced stealth, their movements coordinated by decades of experience. Carlos and Miguel, now working alongside them, provided crucial intelligence about the compound's layout. Ramon's wired the main storage area, Miguel reported, monitoring radio traffic. He's got enough explosives to level 2 ridges. Keeps ranting about showing everyone what real power looks like. Real power, Storm replied quietly, isn't about destruction. It's about precision, about knowing exactly when and how to act. He turned to Cooper. All units in position? Ready on your mark, Captain, just like old times. Storm looked at the tactical display one last time, his mind working through angles and options just as he had in countless combat situations. The stable that had started everything still stood proud behind them, its sign now representing something larger than one family's defiance. All units, he keyed his radio, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided men through Iraq's worst battles. Execute Operation Thunderhorse. Remember, we're not just stopping destruction, we're preventing a tragedy. Move with precision, move with purpose. The veterans began their approach to the compound, their movements silent and coordinated. 3 squadrons strong, they moved like ghosts through the Montana morning, preparing to show Ramon the true meaning of power, not the power of explosives and fear, but the power of disciplined strength and unbreakable unity. The compound swam in pre-dawn shadows as Ramon Vargas paced between improvised explosive devices, muttering to himself. Sweat darkened his expensive shirt despite the cool morning air. The listening devices Miguel had left behind carried his increasingly erratic monologue to the veteran command post. Think they can just ride in here, he muttered, adjusting another detonator. Think their precious experience means anything against this. He patted a cluster of explosives with disturbing affection. Let them come. Let them all come. In the command center, Storm listened to Ramon's ranting with the same calm focus he'd shown during the worst firefights in Iraq. Carlos stood beside him, his professional assessment confirming their worst fears. Those are military-grade explosives, Captain, he said quietly. The blast radius, half the valley would be gone. Not just explosives, Miguel added, having finally chosen to help them fully. He's rigged the compound's fuel storage tanks too. If those go up... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Storm studied the compound schematic Carlos had provided. his mind working through angles and options. "Dad, remember that mission in '07, the surrounded village?" Thomas nodded grimly. "Similar setup. Insurgents had it wired to blow. Civilian casualties would have been catastrophic." "How'd you get everyone out of that one?" "I didn't," Storm replied, his eyes still on the map. "What do you mean?" Miguel asked, fascinated by these glimpses into their shared past. "The village wasn't just wired," Thomas explained, pride evident in his voice. "It was surrounded by insurgent forces who'd rigged the whole area. Everyone said it was suicide to attempt a rescue, but Storm..." He looked at his son with understanding. "Storm didn't try to evacuate. Sometimes Storm traced a route on the current compound map. The best way past a trap is straight through it. Cooper coordinated with the veteran teams now surrounding the compound, each group moving with practiced silence, taking positions with the precision that came from decades of training. Carlos and Miguel, now working alongside them, provided crucial insights about cartel protocols and responses. "Ramon's completely unhinged," Miguel reported, monitoring the surveillance. "Keeps talking about legends and ghosts, about showing everyone what real power looks like." "He still has 12 men with him?" Storm asked. "Yes, but they're scared. They've never seen him like this. These aren't true believers anymore. They're hostages to his madness." Through the command center windows, Storm could see the first hint of dawn touching the eastern sky, the same light that had illuminated countless cavalry operations in Iraq, now preparing to shine on one final mission. "All units report ready," Cooper announced. "Awaiting your order, Captain." Storm keyed his radio, his voice carrying to 3 squadrons of veterans now positioned around the compound. "Remember your training. Remember why we're here. This isn't about revenge. It's about preventing tragedy, about showing there's always another way." Miguel watched in amazement as the veterans acknowledged with practiced efficiency. No wasted words, no dramatic promises, just the quiet confidence of people who'd faced worse odds and prevailed. "They're really going to do this?" he whispered to Carlos. "They're going to try to save everyone, even Ramon." "Of course they are," Carlos replied, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's what makes them different, what makes them better." Inside the compound, Ramon's radio crackled with increasingly desperate reports from his remaining men. "They're everywhere, boss. The veterans, like ghosts, can't track their movements, can't predict their positions." Storm's voice cut through the chatter, calm and clear over all frequencies. "Ramon Vargas, you have one last chance. Surrender now. Let your men walk out, and we end this without bloodshed." Ramon's laugh carried an edge of madness. "You think I'm afraid of you? You're nothing, just another soldier playing hero." "No, son," Storm replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I'm not playing anything, and neither are the 3 squadrons of combat veterans currently surrounding your position. We've all seen real war, real courage, real power. What you're showing now, that's just fear wearing a brave mask." For a moment, silence held. Then Ramon's voice returned, darker than before. "You want to talk about power? I'll show you power. I'll show everyone what happens when you corner a serpent." Storm turned to Cooper, both of them recognizing the tone of a man about to do something desperate. "All units," he commanded, "execute Operation Final Dawn. Move with precision, move with purpose." The veterans began their approach, each team, knowing their exact role. This wasn't a chaotic assault. It was a carefully choreographed operation born of countless similar missions. Thomas watched with professional pride as the teams moved in perfect coordination. Like a symphony, he murmured. No, Storm corrected quietly, like a rescue mission. Because that's what this is. We're not just trying to stop Ramon. We're trying to save him. Save everyone. The dawn continued its slow creep across Shadow Valley as the operation commenced. Storm stood in his command center, coordinating movements with the same calm precision he'd shown in Iraq. The stable that had started everything still stood behind them, its sign now representing something larger than defiance. It represented hope. Hope that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path to redemption, always a way to choose a better ending. First light painted Shadow Valley in shades of gold as the veterans began their final approach to the compound. They moved like shadows through the morning mist, their movements carrying the weight of decades of combat experience. Storm's voice came soft and clear through their radio network, guiding each team with the same precision he'd used in countless cavalry operations. Alpha Team, maintain northern approach. Bravo, watch those lines. Charlie, ready on the east. Each command was acknowledged with practiced efficiency. No wasted words, no dramatic promises. Inside the compound, Ramon's remaining men watched their security cameras with growing dread. The veterans seemed to appear and disappear at will, their movements defying normal tactical patterns. They're everywhere, one guard whispered, his finger trembling on his trigger. Like shadows. Shut up, Ramon screamed, his composed cartel leader facade completely shattered. They're just soldiers. They're nothing. But even as he spoke, more veteran teams materialized from the morning shadows. Their approach wasn't the brutal assault Ramon had expected. It was something far more sophisticated, a carefully choreographed dance of position and pressure. Boss, Carlos's voice shook slightly as he watched the monitors. They're not attacking, they're containing us, like they've done this before. We have, Storm's voice came clearly through their radio, making them jump. Fallujah, 2007. A village, rigged with explosives, just like your compound. Want to know how that ended? The memory hit him with crystal clarity as he coordinated the operation. The village had been surrounded by insurgent forces, every approach covered by snipers. The buildings themselves wired to explode. Everyone said it was impossible to save the civilians inside. Team 2 in position, Cooper reported, bringing Storm back to the present. All approaches covered, just like the village. Storm nodded, seeing the parallel patterns between past and present. They think the explosives give them control. They don't understand. Explosives don't care who wins. Captain, Carlos interjected, his professional expertise evident even as a prisoner. Those demolition charges he's using, I know their weaknesses. I can help. Storm studied him carefully, seeing the genuine desire for redemption. Show me. Carlos quickly sketched out the explosive layout, pointing out vulnerabilities. Storm studied it with the same focused attention he'd given target maps in Iraq. Cooper, adjust Alpha Team's approach 3 degrees east. He turned to Carlos. Take Bravo Team. Show them what you know. Then the operation continued with precision timing, each team moving in perfect coordination. Through the compound's cameras, Ramon watched his world shrink as veterans secured position after position. They can't do this, he screamed at his remaining men. We are serpientes, we're feared. Being feared isn't the same as being strong. Storm's voice came through their radios again. Real strength. It's about saving lives, not taking them. About standing for something bigger than yourself. A memory flashed through Miguel's mind. his grandmother lighting candles at church, praying for him to find a better path. Now, watching the veterans move with such disciplined purpose, he finally understood what she'd meant about different kinds of strength. Ramon, he keyed his radio, trying one last time to reach his former boss. Look at how they move. This isn't about intimidation. This isn't about fear. This is what real power looks like. Through the command center windows, Storm watched his teams continue their careful approach, each movement calculated, each position secured with the precision that came from hard-won experience. All teams report final positions, Cooper announced. Ready for Phase 2. Storm picked up his radio, his voice carrying to every veteran in position. Remember, we're not here for revenge. We're here to prevent a tragedy, to show there's always another way. He paused, letting the words sink in, even for those who think they're too far gone. Ramon's laugh crackled through their radios, but it carried more fear than menace now. You think you can just walk in here? You think your experience means anything against this? The sound of him arming another detonator came clearly through the transmission. Son, Storm's voice remained steady. I've walked into worse places for better reasons. The question isn't whether we can stop you. The question is, are you ready to learn what real strength looks like? The morning sun climbed higher as the operation reached its crucial moment. 3 squadrons of veterans held their positions, waiting for Storm's signal. They'd faced worse odds in harder places, but the stakes here were just as high. Not just lives, but the chance to show that even in the darkest moment, there was always a path to redemption. Through his binoculars, Storm watched Ramon pace inside. His command room, his movements becoming more erratic. The detonator in his hand caught the morning light, a small device with the power to destroy so much. Just like Fallujah, he murmured to himself. Sometimes the hardest part isn't reaching the target, it's showing them why they should choose to live. Carlos moved his team into final position, their movements now matching the veteran precision. Ready on your mark, Captain, he reported. His former cartel allegiance transformed into something more honorable. Storm looked one last time at the compound, seeing not just the current crisis, but echoes of every impossible mission he'd ever attempted. All units, he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of years of combat experience. Execute Operation Steel Dawn. Remember your training, remember why we're here. The veterans began their final approach, moving with the kind of precision that only comes from facing death and choosing life time after time. They weren't just approaching a dangerous situation. They were moving to prove that real power isn't about destruction. It's about having the strength to offer salvation even to those who think they don't deserve it. The entry teams breached the compound's outer perimeter with surgical precision. Each movement was calculated, each step placed with the certainty that came from countless combat operations. Storm's voice guided them through their earpieces, directing the complex operation like a conductor leading an orchestra of shadows. Team 1, East Corridor secured, Cooper reported. Moving to Phase 2. Ramon watched through the security feeds as his outer defenses crumbled, not through violence or brute force, but through a level of tactical expertise he'd never encountered. His men were being systematically isolated and contained, often without even realizing it was happening. How are they doing this? He demanded, grabbing a lieutenant by the collar. How do they know every move before we make it? Because they're not fighting us, Miguel replied from his new position with the veterans. They're rescuing us from yourself. The detonator trembled in Ramon's hand as he shoved his lieutenant away. Rescuing? I'll show them rescue. He moved toward the main explosive cache, but Miguel's voice stopped him. You know what's really happening here? They're showing us what real professionals look like. Miguel pulled his weapon, but instead of aiming at the approaching veterans, he pointed it at Ramon. I won't let you kill us all for your pride. Through the compound's corridors, Carlos led a specialized team of veterans, his intimate knowledge of the layout proving invaluable. Next, Junction has pressure plates, he whispered, but there's a maintenance bypass through the ventilation system. Thomas worked with another team, systematically disarming the explosives they encountered. His horsemanship expertise, combined with Storm's tactical training, created a formidable combination. These charges are linked in sequence, he reported. Find the master control unit and we can isolate the entire network. Storm's voice came through their comms, steady and assured. Remember the village, Cooper. Same principle. We're not just clearing rooms, we're clearing paths, creating options. Contact front, a veteran called out softly. 3 of Ramon's men had taken position at a corridor intersection, but something in the veterans' approach made them hesitate. Look at how they move, one cartel member whispered to another, like shadows, like they've done this 1,000 times. Carlos stepped into view, hands raised. Because they have. Question is, do you want to be the last ones to die for Ramon's madness, or the first ones to help us stop it? The cartel members looked at each other, then at their weapons, then at the veterans moving with such deadly grace. Their guns clattered to the floor. In the command center, Storm watched the operation unfold through multiple feeds. Each team moved in perfect coordination, executing a plan that seemed to anticipate every contingency. But he knew from hard experience that no plan survived contact with a desperate enemy. Ramon's moving deeper into the compound, Cooper reported. Taking his core group with him, still has the main detonator. He's heading for the fallback position, Carlos announced. Underground storage area. It's where we kept our reserve ammunition. If he triggers the explosives there, Storm's eyes narrowed as he studied the compound schematic. He's not running, he's setting a trap, trying to draw us in. He keyed his radio. All teams hold position, maintain containment. Let's show him what real patience looks like. Ramon's voice suddenly burst through their radio network, high and strained. You think you've won? You think your precious experience means anything? I've got enough explosives down here to turn this whole compound into a crater. Son. Storm's reply carried the weight of years of combat wisdom. If I had $1 for every time someone told me they had the ultimate weapon, I could have rebuilt my father's stable twice over. His voice softened slightly. It's not too late to choose a different ending. Different ending. Ramon's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. I'm writing this ending. Me! The sound of him arming the final detonator came through clearly. In the ventilation system above the storage area, Carlos froze. Through a grate, he could see Ramon and his remaining loyalists setting up their last stand. The detonator gleamed in Ramon's shaking hand. Captain, he whispered into his radio, I've got a clear line of sight. I could... Negative, Storm cut him off. That's exactly what he wants. Sometimes the hardest part of combat isn't knowing when to act. It's knowing when to wait. He turned to Cooper, a familiar glint in his eye. Remember that night in Fallujah when we used their own defenses? Against them, Cooper grinned. Position 3 variant with a twist. Storm keyed his radio again. All teams prepare for Operation Echo Dawn. We're going to show Ramon the difference between having power and knowing how to use it. The veterans began moving into new positions, executing a strategy that had been proven in the hardest combat. Zones on Earth. They weren't just trying to stop a madman, they were trying to save him from himself. And as the morning sun climbed higher over Shadow Valley, Storm Blackwood prepared to demonstrate one final time that real strength isn't found in explosives or threats. It's found in the patience to wait for the right moment and the wisdom to know that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to show them a better path. Operation Echo Dawn commenced with absolute silence. No radio chatter, no movement sounds, just the quiet efficiency of veterans who'd learned their craft in the world's deadliest combat zones. Through the compound's security feeds, Ramon watched section after section of his cameras go dark. "They're cutting us off," one of his remaining loyalists whispered. "But why aren't they attacking? They're afraid." Ramon gripped the detonator tighter, his knuckles white. The underground storage area had seemed like the perfect defensive position. Now it felt like a tomb. "No," came Storm's voice through their last working radio. "We're not afraid, son. We're just patient. Learned that lesson the hard way in Fallujah. Sometimes victory isn't about who strikes first. It's about who understands the battlefield better." Above them in the ventilation system, Carlos led a team of veterans through the compound's maintenance tunnels. His years of running cartel operations had given him intimate knowledge of every hidden passage. "Next junction has motion sensors," he whispered. "But there's a 3-second delay in the power backup." Thomas coordinated with another team, using his expertise to systematically isolate Ramon's explosive network. "Each section we disconnect reduces his control," he reported. "He may not even realize it's happening." In the command center, Storm watched multiple feeds showing the operation's progress. "Cooper, remember that night outside Mosul when we turned their own bunker system against them?" Cooper nodded. "Same principle here. They think being underground makes them secure. Until they realize they're not in a fortress," Storm finished. Ramon's remaining men jumped at every shadow, every distant sound. The veterans' psychological tactics were having their intended effect. These weren't the brutal attacks they'd expected. This was something far more sophisticated. "Movement East Corridor," one cartel member called out, firing at shadows. His bullets hit nothing but concrete. "Hold your fire," Ramon commanded, but the strain in his voice was evident. "They're trying to make us waste ammunition." "No," Storm's voice came through the radio again. "We're teaching you the difference between shooting and fighting, between having weapons and knowing how to use them." Through his remaining cameras, Ramon watched in growing horror as veterans seemed to appear and disappear at will. Every defensive position he'd established was being systematically compromised, not through frontal assault, but through expertise he couldn't counter. "They're ghosts," one of his men whispered. "Like the stories about him in Iraq. They're not ghosts." Carlos's voice came through hidden speakers they hadn't even known existed. "They're professionals, real ones. Not men who use fear and violence, but soldiers who understand that real strength is about precision, about patience." Mike's team completed another phase of their operation, isolating another section of explosives. "Master control unit identified," he reported. "Ready for final phase." In the ventilation shaft, Carlos's team reached their designated position. Through the grates, they could see Ramon's remaining force growing more unstable by the minute. The psychological pressure was having its intended effect. "Keep them contained," Storm ordered. "Let them feel the walls closing in." Sometimes the hardest part of combat isn't the fighting. It's giving your enemy time to realize they've already lost. Ramon paced frantically, the detonator now slick with his sweat. Every camera feed showed the same thing. Veterans moving. With impossible precision, each team exactly where it needed to be, executing a strategy he couldn't comprehend. "Boss," his last lieutenant whispered, "maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Ramon screamed. "We're still in control. We've still got the explosives. Do you?" Storm's voice carried genuine curiosity. "Look at your monitors again, son. Really look." Ramon stared at his screens, finally seeing what he'd missed. In the background of every feed, veterans were executing a complex operation he'd never noticed. Each team's movements weren't just coordinated, they were systematically cutting off his options. "Impossible," he breathed. "How?" "Not impossible," Storm replied calmly. "Just experienced. We learned these lessons in places where mistakes meant death, where precision wasn't just about winning, it was about survival." Carlos watched through the grate as understanding began to dawn on Ramon's face. The cartel leader was finally realizing that he wasn't facing ordinary opponents. These weren't just veterans, they were masters of their craft, executing a strategy that had been perfected in the harshest combat zones on Earth. "Final teams in position," Cooper reported, "ready for Phase 3. Storm studied the tactical display one last time, seeing not just the current situation, but echoes of countless similar operations. This wasn't just about stopping a threat. It was about showing a better way. "All units," he commanded, "execute Phase 3. Remember, we're not just containing them, we're showing them what real combat experience looks like." The veterans began their final movements, each team functioning as part of a perfectly coordinated whole. They weren't just approaching a dangerous situation, they were demonstrating that true combat expertise isn't about violence. It's about having the wisdom to turn your enemy's strength against them and the patience to let them realize they've been outmaneuvered by superior experience. Phase 3 began with a series of precisely timed power fluctuations throughout the compound. Emergency lights flickered, casting unstable shadows that made every corner seem alive with movement. Ramon's remaining men huddled closer together in the underground storage area, their nerves fraying with each passing moment. "They're in the walls," one whispered, his weapon tracking shadows on the ceiling. "Everywhere," another added, eyes wide. "They're everywhere." Ramon clutched the detonator with trembling hands, his composed cartel leader persona completely shattered. "Keep it together. We still have the explosives. We still have control." "Control." Storm's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Let me tell you about control, son. Fallujah, 2007. Our unit was trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded by an entire insurgent battalion." Despite himself, Ramon found himself asking, "What happened?" "I learned that control isn't about who has the biggest weapon. It's about who has the clearest mind." Thomas's team completed their final preparations, systematically isolating the last explosive charges. "Primary charges disconnected," he reported quietly, "moving to secondary network." In the ventilation system, Carlos guided his team through the final approach. Years of cartel operations had taught him every weakness in the compound's design. Now that knowledge served a different purpose. "Maintenance junction ahead," he whispered. "From here we can access every corner of the storage area." Cooper coordinated the veteran teams as they moved into final position. Each group knew their exact role in what was about to happen. This wasn't just an operation. It was a demonstration of what decades of combat experience looked like in action. Ramon's radio crackled. "East sector compromised." The transmission cut off abruptly. "Report!" Ramon screamed into his radio. "Someone report!" "They can't." Storm's voice came through clearly. "They're a bit busy learning what real tactical superiority looks like. Want to know the interesting part? Not one of them has been harmed. We don't need violence to show strength." Through his remaining security feeds, Ramon watched in growing horror as veterans seemed to materialize from shadows, each team moving with impossible coordination. His men were being systematically isolated and contained, often without even realizing it was happening. "You think this changes anything?" His voice cracked with strain. "I've still got enough explosives to..." "To what?" Storm interrupted gently. "To die? To kill your own men? Look around you, son. Really look. Count your options." Ramon spun in place, finally seeing what he'd missed. His remaining forces had been reduced to just 4 men, all looking increasingly uncertain. The storage area that had seemed like a fortress now felt like a trap. "You can't win this," he declared, but his voice shook. "Already have," Storm replied calmly. "Look at your detonator." Ramon's eyes dropped to the device in his hand. The ready light that had glowed steady red now pulsed weakly, signaling lost connections. "Impossible. The charges have been systematically isolated for the past hour." Thomas's voice came through now. "While you were watching shadows, we were teaching your own explosives to betray you." Carlos's team reached their final position. Through the grates, they could see Ramon's growing realization that he'd been outmaneuvered on every level. "This is what real combat experience looks like." Storm continued, his voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. "Not brutal force, not fear, but the kind of precision that comes from facing death and choosing life, time after time." Ramon's last lieutenant lowered his weapon. "It's over, boss. They've beaten us without firing a shot. That's real." "Power! No!" Ramon raised the detonator. "I still have the master control. I can still..." The grate above him opened silently. Before he could react, Carlos dropped into the room with cat-like grace, veterans flowing in behind him like smoke. "Actually," Carlos said quietly, "you don't. Look at the wiring panel." Ramon's eyes darted to where his explosive controls should have been. The panel was dark, every connection systematically severed during the psychological operation that had kept him distracted. "Impossible," he whispered. "When did you..." "The entire time." Storm's voice came from the doorway as he entered the room, his presence carrying the quiet authority that had guided men through the worst battles in Iraq. "While you were watching for an attack, we were teaching you about real tactical superiority." The morning sun, filtering through the compound's high windows, caught Storm's combat vest, creating an image that made several cartel members instinctively step back. They'd heard stories about the stallion whisperer of Fallujah. Now they understood why. "Choice is yours now, son," Storm said quietly, moving closer. "But choose carefully. Next few seconds determine whether you're remembered as the man who learned from defeat or the one who let pride destroy everything." Ramon's hand tightened on the useless detonator as veterans moved with practiced precision to secure the room. He was surrounded by the kind of combat expertise that couldn't be bought or intimidated, the kind that came only from facing real war and emerging stronger. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. In it lay not just Ramon's fate, but a lesson about the difference between those who used fear as a weapon and those who had transcended fear through experience. Everything hung on what would happen next. Time seemed to freeze in the underground. Storage area. Ramon's finger trembled on the detonator trigger, his eyes wild as he looked from face to face. The veterans maintained their positions with practiced discipline, neither advancing nor retreating. "Think about it," Storm said softly, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar moments. "Really think. All your life, you've used fear as a weapon. How's that working out right now?" Ramon's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. "You think you understand power? I've built an empire on fear, and we dismantled it without firing a shot," Carlos replied, stepping forward slowly. "That's what real power looks like." Thomas moved to Carlos's side, his horsemanship expertise having helped neutralize every explosive threat. "I've been training horses for 50 years. Learned something important about power. It's not about how much force you can generate. It's about how precisely you can apply it." Through the compound's remaining security feeds, they could see other cartel members being processed, not as prisoners, but as people being offered a choice. Veterans guided them with firm but respectful authority, showing through actions what real strength looked like. "Your men are safe," Storm continued, "every single one. We didn't need violence to prove our point. That's the difference between using fear and understanding duty." Ramon's eyes darted between the useless detonator and the veterans surrounding him, their calm precision more unnerving than any show of force could have been. These weren't just old soldiers. They were masters of their craft, demonstrating expertise that made his cartel tactics look amateur. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "How did you do this?" "By remembering what real combat taught us," Cooper answered from his position, "that the biggest victories often come without firing a shot." The morning sun, filtering through high windows, caught Storm's combat gear as he took another step forward. "In Iraq, I learned that saving lives is harder than taking them. That real strength isn't about who can cause the most damage, it's about who can prevent it." Carlos touched the cross at his neck, remembering his grandmother's words about different kinds of strength. Now, watching the veterans work, he finally understood what she'd meant. "It's not too late," he said quietly to Ramon. "They're showing us a better way. Real power, real respect." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Look how they moved, how they thought 10 steps ahead. That's not just experience, that's mastery. The kind of mastery that comes from fighting for something bigger than yourself." Ramon's hand trembled as he looked from the useless detonator to the veterans surrounding him. Their calm precision and coordinated movements were unlike anything he'd ever faced. These weren't just soldiers, they were experts in their craft, applying years of hard-won wisdom to dismantle his operation without firing a shot. "What happens now?" Ramon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Storm stepped forward, his presence commanding yet non-threatening. Now you choose, son. You've seen what real strength looks like. The question is, are you ready to learn him from it?" As if on cue, the compound's main doors opened, letting in the bright Montana morning. Through them, Ramon could see his men being guided out, not as prisoners, but as people being given a second chance. Veterans moved among them with firm but respectful authority, demonstrating through actions what honor truly meant. "No charges will be filed," Storm continued. "No one needs to go to prison. This can end as a learning moment, a chance to grow, if you're willing. Carlos moved to Ramon's side, understanding the significance of the choice being offered. They're giving us an opportunity, boss, to be better than we were, to serve something greater than just ourselves. Tears welled in Ramon's eyes as the magnitude of his defeat sank in. His empire of fear, so carefully cultivated, had crumbled in the face of men and women who transcended fear through hard-earned experience. I don't know how, he admitted brokenly. All I've ever known is force, intimidation. Thomas approached, compassion softening his weathered features. Every master starts as a beginner, son. The first step is always the hardest. But you've seen today what putting aside ego can accomplish. Storm nodded in agreement. In Iraq, I learned that the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves, admitting we need to change, that we've been wrong. That takes a special kind of courage. Through the compound windows, the sun illuminated the faces of the veterans and the cartel members they were guiding. Gone were the sneers and bravado, replaced by glimmers of understanding, even respect. What we saw today, Miguel spoke up, awe coloring his tone, that's what I want to be a part of. Not fear, not cruelty, but that kind of purpose. One by one, Ramon's remaining men laid down their weapons, not as a surrender, but as an acknowledgement that they'd witnessed something profound, a demonstration of what true power, true mastery looked like. Tears streaming down his face, Ramon handed Storm the useless detonator. It was more than a gesture. It was a plea for guidance from a man who'd suddenly glimpsed how small his world had been. Teach me, he whispered hoarsely. Teach me how to be like you, like them. Storm gripped Ramon's shoulder, understanding the courage it took to make that request. The teaching's already begun, son. You're standing in a room full of men and women who faced their darkest hours and emerged stronger. Let them show you what we've learned. As the morning brightened, veterans began leading the cartel members out of the compound. Not as captives, but as students about to embark on a profound journey. Each face held a mix of emotions, trepidation, certainly, but also a growing sense of possibility. Today's not an ending, Storm addressed the assembled group. Today's a beginning, a chance to redefine what strength means, what service looks like. This valley's got a lot of healing to do. I can't think of a better group to guide that process than this one right here. Thomas stepped forward, pride shining in his eyes as he surveyed the assembled veterans and former cartel members. Plenty of room at the stable for anyone who wants to learn a different way. Training horses, serving the community. It's a path to purpose, to redemption. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Men who'd previously known only violence and intimidation now stood straighter, as if catching a glimpse of what their lives could become. Rebecca Martinez approached with other local law enforcement, respect evident in their expressions. This community's ready to heal, she said, ready to move forward. With guidance from men and women like you, I believe we can turn this whole operation into something good, something righteous. Storm turned to Ramon, Carlos, and Miguel. What do you say? Ready to learn what real strength looks like? Ready to serve something bigger than yourselves? In their faces, he saw the same transformation he'd witnessed countless times in Iraq. The moment when lost men discovered a higher purpose, a calling that could reshape their entire world. Ready, Ramon said, voice trembling with emotion. Ready. to try. As the group began to disperse, each person embarking on their own journey of transformation, Storm felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his father, eyes shining with pride and understanding. "You did good, son," Thomas said softly. "Showed them what real leadership looks like, what real courage means." Storm embraced his father, the two men sharing a moment of profound connection. Around them, the valley stirred with new possibility as former adversaries began the hard work of building trust, of forging bonds that could withstand any challenge. "It's just the beginning," Storm murmured, watching as veterans and former cartel members worked side by side to dismantle the compound's defenses. "There's a lot of work ahead, a lot of healing, but this valley's strong. These people are strong. They just needed to be reminded of it." Thomas nodded, understanding the long road ahead. "Strength comes in many forms," he said sagely. "Sometimes it looks like force, like power, but the truest strength, that comes from within, from the courage to change, to grow, to serve something greater than oneself." As the Montana sun climbed higher, a new day dawned over Shadow Valley, a day of reconciliation, of redemption, a day when old wars finally ended and new futures began. In the heart of the valley, Blackwood Stable stood as a beacon of that future. Its weathered sign, once a symbol of defiance, now represented something far more profound: the enduring power of wisdom, of compassion, and of the unbreakable bonds forged by those who had faced the worst of humanity and emerged stronger, wiser, and forever committed to serving the best in themselves and others. The story of Shadow Valley was far from over, but as Storm and Thomas stood shoulder to shoulder, watching their community begin the hard work of healing, they knew one thing. With unshakable certainty, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them the same way they always had. Together, as a family, as a community, and as a testament to the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. In the days following the confrontation at the Serpient compound, Shadow Valley began to transform in ways both subtle and profound. Under the guidance of Storm, Thomas, and the veterans who had answered their call, the community started the hard work of rebuilding trust and forging new paths forward. At Blackwood Stables, the training ring became a place of healing and growth. Former cartel members, led by a repentant Ramon, Carlos, and Miguel, worked alongside veterans to gentle wild horses and mend broken fences. The rhythms of horsemanship, once used to cultivate patience and discipline in young recruits, now served to guide lost souls toward a new sense of purpose. Rebecca Martinez, her deputy badge gleaming in the sun, oversaw the dismantling of the cartel's infrastructure with quiet satisfaction. As she watched veterans and former criminals work side by side to tear down the walls of the compound, she couldn't help but marvel at the power of redemption. "Never thought I'd see the day," she confided to Thomas as they shared a cup of coffee on the stable's porch. "All those months of living in fear, of watching our community slowly surrender to darkness, I never imagined it could change so quickly." Thomas nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. "Fear's a funny thing," he said, watching a young veteran guide Ramon through the process of saddling a skittish colt. "It can make us forget who we are, what we're capable of. But hope," he smiled as the horse nuzzled Ramon's hand, the beginnings of trust emerging. "Hope's got a power all its own, Across the valley, in Eleanor's country kitchen, Mary served up hearty meals to the men and women working to rebuild their community. The diner had become a hub of activity, a place where old rifts began to heal over shared stories and steaming cups of coffee. "I used to dread seeing those black SUVs pull up," she admitted to Storm as he helped her carry plates to a table of veterans. Now I see those same men coming in, but they're different. They're laughing, they're learning, they're becoming something new." Storm understood the transformation all too well. He'd seen it countless times in Iraq, the moment when a person realized that their past didn't have to define their future. "They're discovering what it means to serve," he said, watching as Miguel helped an elderly rancher carry his groceries to his truck. "To be part of something bigger than themselves." As the days turned to weeks, Shadow Valley began to heal in ways both large and small. The Serpient compound, once a symbol of fear and intimidation, was repurposed into a community center, a place where veterans and civilians alike could come together to learn, to grow, and to support one another. Under the guidance of Storm and his team, former Cartel members learned the skills of carpentry, electrical work, and plumbing. They poured their energy into renovating the old buildings, transforming them into classrooms, workshops, and gathering spaces. "Never thought I'd be using my hands to build something up instead of tearing it down," Carlos remarked as he worked alongside Cooper to install a new set of windows. "Feels good, you know. Feels like I'm part of something that matters." Cooper nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. "That's what service is all about," he said, handing Carlos a level. "Using your strengths to make the world a little bit better. One day at a time, one task at a time." As the community center took shape, so too did the bonds between the people working to bring it to life. Veterans shared stories of their time in Iraq, of the lessons they'd learned and the brothers they'd lost. Former Cartel members opened up about the choices that had led them down darker paths and the courage it took to start anew. "I never thought I could change," Ramon admitted one evening as he sat with Storm and Thomas on the stable's porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. "I thought I was too far gone, too broken to ever be anything else." Storm placed a hand on Ramon's shoulder, understanding the weight of those words. "We all have our breaking points," he said softly. "The moments when we think we can't go on, can't be better than we were. But that's when we find out what we're really made of. That's when we choose to rise." Thomas nodded, thinking back to his own moments of doubt and despair. "It's not about being perfect," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "It's about being willing to learn, to grow, to become something more than you were yesterday." As the weeks turned to months, Shadow Valley continued to transform. The community center became a beacon of hope and healing, a place where people from all walks of life could come together to learn, to serve, and to grow. Veterans began leading workshops on everything from horsemanship to carpentry, sharing the skills they'd honed in service to their country. Former Cartel members, once lost in a world of violence and intimidation, found new purpose in mentoring at-risk youth, showing them that there was always another path. "I never thought I could be a role model," Miguel confessed to Storm one afternoon as they watched a group of teenagers learn the basics of horse care. "I never thought I could be someone that kids looked up to." Storm smiled, understanding the power of that realization. "We all have the capacity to inspire," he said, watching as a young girl laughed with delight as she brushed a mare's coat. "To show others that change is possible, that hope is real, As Shadow Valley healed, so too did the hearts of those who called it home. Families once torn apart by fear and mistrust found their way back to one another, their bonds stronger for the challenges they'd faced. Mary's grandson, Luke, who had once watched the cartel's movements with terror in his eyes, now spent his afternoons at the community center learning woodworking from Carlos and horseback riding from Ramon. "I never thought I could be brave," he confided to his grandmother one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. But watching Storm and the others, seeing how they faced their fears, how they fought for what was right, it made me want to be brave too. Mary pulled him close, tears in her eyes as she marveled at the young man he was becoming. "You've always been brave, Luke," she whispered. "You just needed to be reminded of it." Months turned to years, and Shadow Valley continued to thrive. The community center became a model of resilience and hope, a place where people from all backgrounds could come together to build a better future. Storm and Thomas, once the quiet guardians of a town under siege, now found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Their story, and the stories of the men and women who had fought alongside them, spread far beyond the borders of their small Montana valley. Veterans from across the country began making pilgrimages to Blackwood Stables, drawn by the promise of healing and purpose. They came to learn from Storm and his team, to share their own stories of struggle and triumph, and to be reminded that their service had meaning beyond the battlefield. "What you've built here," one old soldier confided to Storm as they sat together in the stable's tack room, "it's more than just a community center. It's a beacon of hope. A reminder that even in our darkest hours, there's always a way forward." Storm nodded, thinking back to the countless moments of despair and determination that had led them to this point. "We all have our battles," he said, softly. "Some of them we fight on foreign soil, others we fight in our own hearts. But the thing about battles, they're meant to be won. One day at a time, one choice at a time." As the years passed, Shadow Valley became a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a place where broken souls found healing, where lost hearts found purpose, and where the bonds of community proved stronger than any force that sought to tear them apart. And at the center of it all stood Blackwood Stables, its weathered sign, a reminder of the unbreakable strength that had seen them through their darkest days, a strength born of compassion, of service, and of the unwavering belief that even in the face of the greatest darkness, hope would always find a way to rise. For Storm, Thomas, and the countless others who had fought to defend that hope, Shadow Valley was more than just a place on a map. It was a promise, a legacy, and a reminder that the true measure of a warrior's strength lay not in the battles they fought, but in the peace they sought to build in their wake. And as the sun set over the mountains, casting the valley in a warm, golden glow, that peace seemed to settle over the land like a blessing. A reminder that even in a world shadowed by fear and doubt, there would always be those who stood ready to defend the light, to serve the greater good, and to prove that the bonds of brotherhood, once forged in the crucible of war, could never be broken by the passing of time or the trials of fate. In the heart of Shadow Valley, Blackwood Stables stood as a testament to that enduring truth, its doors open to all who sought shelter, strength, and the unbreakable bonds of community that had seen them through the darkest of storms and into the light of a brighter, more hopeful tomorrow. As the years passed and Shadow Valley flourished under the guidance of Storm, Thomas, and the community they had nurtured, the story of their triumph over darkness began to spread far beyond the borders of their quiet corner of Montana. The tale of a town besieged by fear and violence, and the quiet strength of the men and women who had stood against the tide, became a source of inspiration for countless others facing their own battles. Journalists and filmmakers began to arrive in the valley, drawn by the promise of a story that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit. They came to interview Storm and Thomas, to walk the halls of the community center that had risen from the ashes of the Serpient compound, and to bear witness to the extraordinary transformation that had taken place. Among them was a young woman named Sarah, a documentary filmmaker from New York City who had grown weary of telling stories of darkness and despair. When she heard about Shadow Valley and the unlikely alliance between veterans and former cartel members that had saved it, she knew she had found the story she had been searching for. "What you've done here," she said to Storm as they sat together on the porch of Blackwood Stables, watching the sun rise over the mountains, "it's more than just a story of redemption. It's a story of hope, of the power we all have to change the course of our lives and the lives of those around us." Storm nodded, his eyes distant as he thought back to the countless moments of doubt and determination that had led them to this point. "Hope is a funny thing," he said softly. "It's not about waiting for the light to come. It's about being the light, even in the darkest of times." As Sarah spent time in the valley, interviewing the men and women who had fought to defend it, she began to understand the true depth of the transformation that had taken place. She spoke with Ramon, Carlos, and Miguel, listening as they shared their stories of redemption and the hard work of building a new life from the ashes of the old. "I never thought I could be more than what I was," Ramon confided in her one evening. As they sat together in the community center's garden, the scent of fresh herbs and flowers filling the air. "I thought I was destined to live and die in the shadows, never knowing what it meant to stand in the light." Sarah listened, her heart aching for the man who had once been lost to darkness. "But you found your way out," she said softly. "You found the courage to change, to become something more." Ramon nodded, his eyes filling with tears as he thought of the countless second chances he had been given. "I had help," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had Storm and Thomas and all the others who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. They showed me that there was another way, that I could be part of something bigger than myself." As Sarah continued her work, she began to see the true impact of what Storm and his team had accomplished. She watched as former cartel members taught carpentry and horse care to at-risk youth, their faces alight with the joy of passing on the skills they had learned. She listened as veterans shared their stories of healing and purpose, their voices strong and clear as they spoke of the bonds they had forged in the crucible of war. And through it all, she began to understand the true power of the community that had risen from the ashes of violence and fear. A community built on the unshakable foundation of compassion, service, and the belief that every person, no matter their past, had the capacity for redemption. As the months passed and Sarah's documentary took shape, the story of Shadow Valley began to spread even further. People from all walks of life, from all corners of the country, began to make the pilgrimage to the small Montana town, drawn by the promise of a place where hope had triumphed over darkness. Among them was a young veteran named John, who had returned from Afghanistan, haunted by the ghosts of his past. For years, he had struggled to find his place in a world that seemed to have no use for the skills he had honed on the battlefield. But when he heard about Shadow Valley and the work that Storm and his team were doing, he knew he had found his calling. "I've been lost for so long," he confided to Storm as they worked together to gentle a wild Mustang, the sun setting over the mountains in a blaze of orange and gold. "I thought I'd never find my way back to the light, never find a reason to keep going." Storm understood the feeling all too well. He had seen it in the eyes of countless veterans who had passed through the halls of Blackwood stables, their spirits broken by the weight of their experiences. But he had also seen the spark of hope that could be rekindled, the ember of purpose that could be coaxed back to life. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You never were, and you never will be, not as long as there are people like us who understand what it means to fight for something bigger than ourselves." As John spent time in the valley, working alongside the veterans and former cartel members who had found new purpose in service, he began to feel the weight of his past lifting from his shoulders. He learned to trust again, to open his heart to the possibility of a future that was not defined by the battles he had fought, but by the peace he sought to build. And he was not alone. As the years passed, more and more veterans began to make their way to Shadow Valley, drawn by the promise of healing and purpose that had become synonymous with the small Montana town. They came from all branches of the military, from all walks of life, united by the unbreakable bonds of service and sacrifice. Under the guidance of Storm and his team, they learned to gentle wild horses and mend broken fences, to build houses and plant gardens. They learned to tell their stories, to share their pain and their triumphs, and to find strength in the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves. And as they healed, so too did the community around them. The youth of Shadow Valley, once lost and adrift, found new purpose in the mentorship of the veterans and former cartel members who had fought so hard to defend their home. They learned the skills of carpentry and horsemanship, of leadership and service, and began to see themselves not as victims of circumstance, but as architects of their own destinies. As Sarah's documentary premiered to critical acclaim, the story of Shadow Valley became a beacon of hope for countless others facing their own battles. People from all over the world began to reach out to Storm and his team, seeking guidance and inspiration in their own struggles. And Storm, ever the quiet leader, found himself at the center of a growing movement. He spoke at conferences and universities, sharing the lessons he had learned on the battlefields of Iraq and in the heart of Shadow Valley. He counseled veterans and civilians alike, reminding them that the true measure of a warrior's strength lay not in the battles they fought, but in the peace they sought to build. Years turned to decades, and Shadow Valley continued to thrive. The community center became a hub of learning and growth, a place where people from all walks of life could come together to build a better future. The youth who had once been lost found their way, becoming leaders in their own right, carrying on the legacy of service and compassion that had been passed down to them. And at the heart of it all stood Blackwood Stables, its weathered sign a testament to the unbreakable spirit that had seen them through the darkest of times. For Storm and Thomas, it was more than just a place of business. It was a sanctuary, a reminder of the love and sacrifice that had brought them to this moment. As they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, Storm felt a sense of peace wash over him. He thought back to the countless battles he had fought, both on foreign soil and in his own heart, and knew that every step had been leading him to this moment. "We've come a long way," Thomas said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he looked out over the land that had been in his family for generations. Storm nodded, his eyes distant as he thought of all the lives that had been touched by the work they had done. "We have," he said, his voice firm with conviction, "but there's still so much more to do, so many more hearts to heal, so many more stories to tell." And as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in a warm golden glow, Storm knew that he would never stop fighting for the light, never stop serving the greater good. For in the end, that was what it meant to be a warrior. Not just to fight the battles that needed fighting, but to build the peace that would endure long after the last shot had been fired. With a smile, he turned to his father, the man who had taught him everything he knew about strength and sacrifice. "What do you say, Dad?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Ready for the next adventure?" Thomas laughed, the sound ringing out across the valley like a blessing. "Always, son," he said, clapping Storm on the shoulder. "Always." And together, they stood and made their way back to the stables, back to the work that had become their life's calling, back to the heart of Shadow Valley, where the bonds of brotherhood and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit would always light the way home. As the years turned to decades, Shadow Valley continued to thrive under the guidance of Storm, Thomas, and the community they had nurtured. The story of their triumph over darkness spread far and wide, inspiring countless others to find hope and purpose in the face of their own struggles. Veterans and civilians alike made the pilgrimage to the small Montana town, drawn by the promise of healing and redemption. They came to learn from Storm and his team, to share their own stories of sacrifice and resilience, and to be part of something greater than themselves. And at the heart of it all stood Blackwood Stables, a testament to the unbreakable spirit that had seen them through the darkest of times. It was a sanctuary, a beacon of hope, and a reminder that even in the face of the greatest challenges, the bonds of brotherhood and the strength of the human spirit would always light the way home. As Storm and Thomas stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, they knew that their journey was far from over. There were still more hearts to heal, more stories to tell, and more battles to be won. But they were ready, for they knew that together there was nothing they could not overcome. Dear viewers, thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through Shadow Valley. If you've been inspired by the story of Storm, Thomas, and the brave men and women who fought alongside them, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue to bring you more tales of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. And if you know someone who could benefit from hearing this story, please don't hesitate to share it with them. Together, we can spread the message of Shadow Valley far and wide and remind the world that even in the darkest of times, there is always a reason to keep fighting for the light. Thank you again for being a part of our community, and we look forward to sharing more incredible stories with you in the future.